Well, hello all. I'm starting to hear rumors that we're suddenly going to have a whole group of you leave and go to the airport to get out before the 3-day snowstorm that comes in. So, hopefully the bulk of you that stay, it'll be great to hang out with you until Tuesday. I hope you've had a good morning. It's just great seeing the buzz, the energy, the conversations, people talking about some of these fun and important issues of education. So at this point, I've got a real pleasure when we're putting together our list of who would we like to invite down to present at our event and to give us an overview of the landscape of education. It's such an important element. You really can't talk MOOCs without, or even emerging educational models, without taking some time to consider the breadth of the education system and some of the challenges that are arising in that system. And so we're very pleased to have Jeffrey Selingo accept our invitation to present at the event. So a bit of background on Jeff. He's an author, a columnist, a speaker. He has spent his journalism career working in the business of colleges and universities worldwide. He recently published a book called College Unbound, The Future of Higher Education, What It Means for Students. It essentially looks at the colleges of tomorrow, how families are going to pay, what campuses will look like, the student market in terms of what the kinds of skills they'll need to enter the employment force. He's also a contributing editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, a professor of practice at Arizona State, and his work focuses on innovation in education, higher education, and how students, parents, and employers should really look at or value what is increasingly becoming the biggest purchases in their life in the form of a college degree. He used to be the top editor at the Chronicle. He's been working in this field in a variety of ways for 16 years, and he has appeared, his work has appeared in New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street, Huffington Post. So on that note, Jeff, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, George. Thanks for that kind introduction, and feel free to finish up your lunch if you're still eating. So I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. How many times do you think we've talked about MOOCs more than 100 times today? Mentioned that word more than 100 times? How many people think more than 100 times? More than 1,000. Wow, okay. I'm going to try to do a talk that only mentions it maybe 5 or 6. I'm actually going to try to take us up to about the 50,000-foot level to talk to you about where I think higher education is going and some of the current challenges that what we call traditional higher education is facing. Most of it will come from the reporting in my book, so if you read the book or you've seen me talk about the book before, you can leave if you want and get to the airport. Or I would welcome you to stay and we'll have Q&A at the end. I do want to make 3 confessions before I start, and I think it's particularly important with this audience, mostly of researchers and mostly people who work on college campuses. I have never worked on a college campus, although technically now I'm an adjunct at Arizona State, but I do not live in Tempe. So I've never worked on a college campus. All my work in higher ed has come from the outside, covering higher education for the last 16 years in a variety of roles. So that's number 1. Number 2, I am not a researcher. And I now say this a lot because when I give talks, a couple months ago I was speaking to a group of faculty members in Kentucky, and at the end of the talk, a faculty member at the back raised her hand and wanted to know about my research methods. And I said, well, I'm a journalist, and in journalism, if you have 3 anecdotes, you have a trend. So if you ever want to know how the New York Times comes up with those ridiculous trend stories, or the Chronicle, or anybody else for that matter, they found, their mother-in-law, their cousin, and their neighbor. And they had 3 people, and they got a trend. But in all seriousness, as a journalist, I go out and interview the experts, I read the research, and I try to interpret it for a lay audience. And that's the third piece of this, the lay audience. I'm glad to talk about this book in front of folks who work and live and breathe higher education every day, because I really appreciate all that you do. But I actually wrote this for a lay audience. I wrote this for people outside of higher education. I wrote this for the parents and students who are consuming higher education every day or are thinking about consuming higher education in the future if they're prospective students and parents. And so it really required me to change my vision, my field of vision, because for 16 years at the Chronicle, as many of you know, the Chronicle is like, the Wall Street Journal covers the finance world for people in the finance world, and the Chronicle covers higher education for people in higher ed. And I really had to kind of change my focus and really think about being in the shoes of parents and students. And parents and students, by the way, students being at any level, not just traditional 18-year-olds or really non-traditional 18-year-olds today, but 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, anybody who is consuming higher education. I was started to think about this book back in 2011, and when I was talking to an editor at a publisher about it, he said, I really want a book on the future of higher ed because people are very anxious about higher ed, and anytime people are anxious about something, books sell. Right? So if you're looking for a job, if you're about to be a new parent, anything that you're anxious about, you go out and usually buy a book about. And I was actually anxious at that time because my wife and I were about to have our second child. So our second child was born in the fall of 2011, and I was really starting to think about her future and the future of her older sister and the future of higher ed. And I was pretty anxious because I was thinking about this. I was thinking about how much college would cost by the time she was ready for college at the end of the next decade. About $100,000 to go to a public. That's just tuition alone over 4 years. If she graduated, of course, in 4 years, and perhaps upwards of $186,000 in terms of a sticker price to send her to a private college for 4 years. But more than that, I started to think about how different her life would be than my life or my grandparents' life or my parents' life over the last couple of generations. And I thought about her life and my kids' life in general would be different in 3 key ways that I think will have a large impact on the future of higher education. And the first is that she could be among a large number of people who actually live to see their 100th birthday. And so we are increasingly having longer lifespans, but yet we think of college as one time in our life, usually at 18 still today, even though our lifespans have increased dramatically over the last couple of decades. At the same time, she's probably going to have multiple careers and multiple jobs. And yet when people say they're going to college, what's the first question we ask them? What are you going to major in? We still have this enormous focus on the college major as it's the thing that you're going to do for the rest of your life, even though we are entering and already in a generation that is going to have multiple jobs and multiple careers over the course of their lifetime. And of course, the biggest impact that I think she was going to have in coming into this world is that she's living in a much more different world than I came into or many of us came into in terms of it's much more hyper-connected. Students are toggling between devices much more than any of us do. And it's much more social. It's much more flat. It's much more interconnected than ever before. And we're already seeing this having an impact on today's college graduates. We know that this whole world is flat phenomenon obviously impacted high school graduates more than a decade ago, but we're now starting to see it impact college graduates. And if you look at the class of 2013, this is the class that just graduated last spring, you can see how much they're struggling to launch by the number of jobs that they're applying for, by the percentage of them that are unemployed, 9% unemployed, and if you looked at underemployed and those still looking for jobs, it actually jumps to 18%. And of course, they're graduating with about $30,000 in debt. Now, some of this is because of the broader economy, but some of it is because of broader changes in society in general. Tony Carnevale, an economist a behavioral economist at Georgetown University, came out with a study a couple of weeks ago called Struggling to Launch, or Failure to Launch. And he was talking about this generation in their 20s. And it used to be that we went to college. The old model was that we went to college, we started a job, probably stayed in that job for 30 or 40 years, and then retired. And now there's a new model that really started to emerge in the 1980s and very much in the last decade, where students go to college, they graduate, and they're still trying to feel their way. They're checking out jobs, they're doing extended internships, and what he calls this period of learning and earning during your 20s until you kind of really get settled in a career now around 30. And in fact, he has calculated that the average age of financial independence for today's college graduates is, get this, 30. So if you have kids in their 20s and they're living in your basement or you're still sending a check to them every so often, you're going to have to at least do it until they're 30. But it's this whole idea that we started to really rethink based on those trends I just talked about, that the fact that we're living longer and the fact that we are that students are moving through their careers multiple times in their lifetimes, that this new model has emerged. But yet despite this, we still have a higher education system that for the most part is really rooted in the industrial age. One that was built for that old model where you educated students between 18 and 22, sent them on to the world into one career. They did that for X number of years, and then they ended up retiring. And we see this in thinking about how we educated students back in the 1950s with the professor at the front of the room lecturing to students. And of course, we enter into this decade, and it's still happening. It's in color now, and this is what I refer to as the original distance education, with students way in the back. The Chronicle just recently conducted a study of 1,200 faculty members, and 64% of them said under no circumstances is the quality of online education equal to the quality of a face-to-face educational experience. Obviously, they were not thinking of this when they were thinking of face-to-face. And so when we think of college today, we really still think of it as kind of this linear progression. Entering at one place, usually one physical place, spending 4 years there, and then graduating with a bachelor's degree. And when we think of college, these are some of the images that come to mind. As I was interviewing folks for the book, they kept talking about, the campus quads, the fall football weekends. They kept talking about all these images of what they think of as college. And I refer to this in the book as the Hollywood version of higher education, because in actuality, only 2 in 10 undergraduates, 20% of undergraduates, go to residential colleges full-time and obviously graduate, hopefully, in 4 years. But this is really what I call now the Hollywood version, because it really is what appears in the movies when we think about higher education, not what is happening in reality for most students. And in fact, the traditional higher education system is actually not working for a lot of students. So a third of students now transfer at least once before they earn a bachelor's degree. This is data coming from the National Student Clearinghouse. And increasingly, by the way, they're reverse transferring. They're going from 4-year institutions to 2-year institutions. 4 in 5 students report to researchers they're kind of drifting through college, right? They're not quite sure why they're there, except somebody encouraged them to go there, and they had nowhere else to really go after college. And then 400,000 drop out every year. We refer to these students as dropouts. I like to refer to them as they didn't graduate, because the system, in my mind, failed them. They didn't always fail the system. I think in the American business community, if a company lost 50% of its customers, it's unlikely we would blame the customer. We would most likely blame the company for losing that many students. And so I really see us shifting in the coming decade to a system that is much less one-size-fits-all, because it's not working for that one size, and one that is much more a la carte, that's less linear, and that is much more of an individualized pathway that really, I think, is designed around what students need in this new economy: critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration. And I saw an example, a small example of what something like this could be a couple of months ago. I was invited to get on the Millennial Trains Project, which was, they brought 24 millennials, average age was 25, and they put them on a train from the West Coast to the East Coast, 10-day train trip. And each of them had to crowdsource their funding to get on there, and then they each had to come up with a project. And they worked on this project, this independent learning project over the course of those 10 days on this train. And they would stop in towns along the way. Part of the purpose of this was to see the interior part of the country, which many of these students have never seen. They would stop during the day. They would work on these independent research projects in the cities they stopped in. They would meet with entrepreneurs and others, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, to learn about what was happening in that community and in that state. And then at night, they would travel between towns, and they would have lecturers come on board and give a lecture, and then they would have a kind of a salon well into the night. And when I asked the students on board this project, what are some of the things that you really liked about this experience compared to college? They kept talking about a lot of the same things. They kept talking about the idea of collaboration, of learning from others, of self-directed learning, of the projects that they were working on, and how they were trying to solve problems at the same time. And in fact, many of the things that they talked about what they liked about being on that train for that week, are many of the same things in survey after survey that employers say they want out of today's college graduates. Written and oral communication skills, managing multiple priorities, solving problems, and collaborating with others. But yet, the Millennial Trains project that I went on, and by the way, he's running 2 more of these over the next year, was not created by any college, was not created by any institution as we think of it, but was created by a 26-year-old college graduate, former Fulbright scholar, who did a similar thing when he was in India on his Fulbright scholar. So it wasn't created by an institution that we think of today. And his goal was really to create something that really fueled the curiosity and innovation of this generation and how they wanted to learn. And his end goal was to teach students to learn on their own, but still be guided by people around them. And that's really what is at the center of the thesis of my book, is that I believe that we're moving toward a future, and this is very similar to Jim's talk this morning, where the student is really at the center of his or her learning experience and not necessarily the institution. So we really make a shift away from higher education, the institution, and much more to the student. And I don't think necessarily that technology will take over in this. I think that there will be injections of technology, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think this allows for a style of learning that didn't even exist, wasn't even possible even 10 years ago. And I think technology is going to enable that, but not necessarily take over in this process. And in the end, I think that students will learn better because they will help direct their learning experience. And how could this potentially happen? I see this as much more of a personalized experience where we mix together things that are already happening today, but much more in individualized pathways. It's really interesting. Our lives promote diversity. When you think about how we learn every day about new things and how we live our lives promote diversity, but our education system, in so many ways, promotes conformity. And by doing this, by having much more of a personalized experience, we could take advantage of the diversity of learning experiences that many of us want. Whether that's combining experiential research projects with a traditional classroom, with online and hybrid courses, with low residency options, meaning students don't necessarily live on campus for 4 years, but they might live on a campus for 1 year. But it provides for a much more individualized experience in the future. And as we move from this one-size-fits-all system that we have today to one that is much more a la carte, I think the attributes of this college of tomorrow, there are 5 of them. I think one is they are increasingly hybrid. I actually don't agree with people like Clay Christensen and others who think thousands of colleges are going to go out of business in the next couple of years. He had a piece in the New York Times last month where he said 25% of the bottom tier of every college will go out of business. Andy Rosen, the CEO of Kaplan, predicted a couple of weeks ago at another conference that in a couple of decades there would only be 600 colleges left. I just think that these institutions are part of our culture in so many ways. I don't think it's easy to put them out of business as some of these people who make these predictions think. So I think 1 will be hybrid. 2 will be much more of blending of experiences. And when I say blending of experiences, I mean between work and internships, but also between high school and college and the workforce. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. 3 will be adaptive. Again, much more personalized to what students know already and what they can and how they can personalize their experience more in the future. The 4th, and I think the first 3 will allow for this, is a much more flexible calendar. One thing I heard over and over again from talking to students and parents for my book was that they wanted much more of a flexible experience in terms of, we talk about how diverse our higher education system is in the U.S., but for the most part, we all start in September and end in May. And then finally, one that is built much more on competencies, on what students know, rather than on how much time they spend in a seat, the current definition of the credit hour. In many ways, this stuff is already happening and has been happening for a long time. We've called these students non-traditional. And what I think is that many more of these students will become what we think of as traditional or today's traditional students much more in the future. And I want to introduce you to some students that I met along my journey in reporting this book and talk a little bit about their pathways through college. The first was Jose James, who was able to I met him at Valencia College in Florida, and he was on this non-linear pathway to the degree, where he ended up going to 3 institutions, finally getting his bachelor's degree for a fraction of the cost as if he went to the one institution from the beginning. And in fact, we used to see students swirl for the last couple of decades, mainly because they didn't quite know what they wanted. They were trying to put together an education on the cheap, and it was always seen as they were the non-traditional students. But increasingly, as you can see, 23% of community college students today come from households earning more than $100,000 a year. This comes from a recent Sallie Mae survey on how students pay for college. Just 5 years ago, that was under 10%. So increasingly now, parents and students who come from more affluent households are starting to see this idea of putting together different educational experiences is just as good in some cases and definitely cheaper in some cases than that kind of linear pathway we used to think in terms of going to college. And the second is mixing course types. And, it's interesting when I talk to presidents and faculty members who really see hybrid courses, online courses, and face-to-face courses in silos. They really think of them in very separate ways. They usually have people in different departments and different administrators overlooking them. But many of today's students don't see big differences between them. And they think, just like when we read a newspaper online, or we read a newspaper on a tablet, or we read a newspaper in physical print, we don't see that many differences between them. Students are not seeing many differences as they toggle between these courses. I met Jennifer Black at the University of Central Florida, who was able to finish her bachelor's degree in 4 years, which is kind of an unusual thing in some public universities these days, because she had the option of taking a quarter of her courses online or in hybrid format over the course of her time at the University of Central Florida. She still had a minor, she did work, she had an internship, but she was able to mix and match courses so much easier than many students are able to today. And in fact, the University of Central Florida estimates they built 9 fewer classroom buildings because of the ability of giving students the flexibility of mixing this online and hybrid format in addition to face-to-face. And then finally, we're talking a lot about MOOCs today and tomorrow, but to me, the biggest innovation happening right now in higher ed is around competency-based degrees. So I met Cheryl Hsu, who was a student at Western Governors University, was able to finish her bachelor's degree in 2 years because she went to Western Governors, which bases its degrees on competencies rather than time spent in a seat. Her shortest class was 2 weeks. Her longest class was 14 weeks. She ended up paying $18,000 for a bachelor's degree that she completed in 2 years. University of Wisconsin, Northern Arizona, University of Southern New Hampshire all put in place this past year competency-based programs, and many other institutions are considering it in addition. And to me, of all the talk about disruption and innovation in higher ed, this to me is probably one of the more interesting ones because it's the one that really truly bends the cost curve when we're talking about cost in higher education. So all of these factors, whether it's competency-based education, whether it's online or hybrid classes, whether it's students who are not spending 4 years on a particular campus, all of this is causing a lot of angst, as you know, on college campuses that I think really kind of pitting the disruptors against the traditionalists. And we don't have a lot of people, unfortunately, in the middle. And I think, as I think about disruptions in other industries, whether it was the music industry, the publishing industry, or my own industry in the newspaper industry, I think about in every single instance we had these camps fighting against each other of the disruptors and the traditionalists, no matter which one, whether it was any of these industries where kind of consumer demand and technology really changed the demand for that industry. When I was researching the book, I came across this quote from a vice president at Amazon. And this quote obviously applies to publishing, but let's think about how this can be applied to higher education. So in publishing now, it's really the writer and the reader are the two necessary people. And we saw this actually in the music industry as well, where it's the artist and the consumer are the really necessary people in the process, and everyone who stands between them has both risk and opportunity. That doesn't mean they disappear, but that everyone who stands between them has both risk and opportunity. If we think about that in higher education, again, we think about what is the role of the institution in the future, when the really necessary people now are the teacher and the student, and everyone who stands between them has both risk and opportunity. I will talk a little bit at the end about what I think are some of the opportunities for traditional colleges in the future to kind of maintain their point. But what I want to talk about right now is in terms of the teacher and the student, because I think this is a really good time in many cases to be a teacher, and in many cases it's a great time to be a student, and it's not so great of a time to be an institution. So let me tell you about why I think that is. So this is Sam. This is Sam. There we go. This is Sam Romano, and I interviewed him in the book. So he was one of the students in the massive AI course that Sebastian Thrun and Peter Norvig taught a couple of years ago. And Sam was a recent graduate of Stetson University in Florida. He was thinking about going back to get his master's degree in computer science. He was at the time working for a defense contractor outside of Orlando, and he really wanted a job at Google. And he said, wow, if I really want a job at Google, he learned about the course that Thrun and Norvig were teaching, and he said, wow, these guys have connections to Google. Maybe if I do well in the course, I could get a job there. And so he decided to sign up for the course. He persuaded a couple of other coworkers to sign up for the course with him. And every morning, instead of going out for their morning coffee break, the small group would get together and would have a study session. And then he would go home at night. He would get together with a couple of his buddies. They would do some of the lectures together. If they didn't get a point of a lecture, of course, they would be able to watch it over and over and over again, unlike in a traditional classroom, where if he missed the point, he would be totally lost. And at the end of the semester, he was one of the students who scored near the top in the course, and he got a letter asking for his resume. He passed on his resume back to Peter Norvig and to Sebastian Thrun. They ended up passing it on to Google. A month after the course ended, he got an interview at Google, and today he's working for Google in Pittsburgh. Of course, he's one example, and I understand that he's kind of an outlier, and not a ton of people got a job through that course. But the point here is that here was a student who was thinking about going back to get his master's degree, and was already starting the process of doing that. Came across this free online course, decided to take it, learned what he felt like he needed to learn, and was able to get the goal, was able to achieve the goal he wanted to achieve, which was to get that job at Google. Of course, by bypassing the traditional system as we know it, meaning the institution. So it's not just, not only do I think it's a great time for students like that, who really have so many more options at their fingertips to get the education that they want and to achieve the goals that they want. But I also think it's a great time if you're a professor and you want to reach a larger group of people. And so much of what we've been talking about today at this conference is about MOOCs on platforms that are at, of course, some of the most prestigious universities in this country. One of the things I enjoyed most about Jim's talk this morning is that there's exciting things going on at many, I've heard of your institution because I don't live that far from you in Washington, D.C., but there's great things going on at all these other institutions. And it's not just the Stanfords of the world and the Penns of the world and the Princetons of the world. This is Tyler Cowen on the right, who's a behavioral economist at George Mason University. And he decided last year, he has a large following on his blog called Marginal Revolution. And he decided last year to put up all his materials online. He started taping some of his lectures at home, and he created his own university, MR University. And he's now reaching, from his home in Northern Virginia, he's now reaching hundreds of thousands of more students than he was able to reach through his course at George Mason. And so, again, if you're a student wanting access to this, and if you're a professor wanting to reach a much larger and have much more of a greater impact than teaching at your own institution, I think this is a wonderful time. The question, though, is what about that middleman? What about the middle institution? It's not so great of a time to be a college or university right now in the United States. The first thing is that 73% of colleges and universities today have flat or declining net tuition revenue. What does that mean? That means net tuition revenue, obviously, is the money that you have left over after you give out financial aid. It's really the cash that you have to make investments in new academic programs, to make investments in buildings, and most of the time now your debt level is at such a point that you can't take on more debt. It's the investments you can make in faculty salaries and everything else. And right now, at 3/4 of American colleges and universities, that net tuition revenue is either flat or declining, which makes this debt number, we talk so much about the crisis in student debt right now, but we don't talk much about the crisis in institutional debt. And I think this makes this number so much more critical because institutions don't have the cash on hand that they used to have to pay off this debt. We all have debt. It's a fine thing to have, to buy our houses and buy our cars and everything else. But we all think we're going to have that job for the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. And when colleges took on this debt over the last decade, they thought that their model, especially their financial model, was going to continue as is for the next 5 or 10 years, at least until the debt was paid off, and it obviously hasn't gone that way. Second is that it's not only a tuition problem, it's not only a cost problem in American higher education, a price problem with tuition, but it's also an income problem in the United States. And so it used to take less than 25% of a family's income to pay for college. For average family income, average college. That was back in 2001. And today it's over 40%. Over 40% average family income in terms of what it takes, the percentage of their income that it takes to pay for college today. And part of this is, obviously, college costs have continued to rise, but the biggest problem is that family income is flat or declining. At the same time, and many of you who work at state universities know this, the states are essentially getting out of the business of higher education. At the current rate, in 2059, the average state budget will reach zero. 38 states out of the 50 gave less to higher education this year than they did 4 years ago. And so if you put all of these things together, what's happening is that more and more institutions, in a way to survive, financially survive, are looking all over the world and in other states and in every pocket of their own community for more students who can pay more of the bill. And in fact, that's really what fueled a lot of the enrollment in the last decade, are students who were high achieving and able to pay most of the bill. So I tell this anecdote in my book, and I wrote a piece about this for the New York Times a couple of months ago, where there was this small private college in the Northeast, and they wanted to know how many students can really pay our full bill. And they looked at the total number of 18-year-olds in the U.S. in 2009. And it was about 4.35 million. Of course, they had to knock out the first 25% because they didn't even graduate from high school. Then they had to look at the students who didn't go to college. They had to toss them out of this analysis. And then, of course, they wanted high-achieving students, students who had high SAT scores. They wanted family incomes over $200,000 so they can pay the full bill of this private institution. And this was a small private institution in the Northeast, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, at the end of this funnel, there were fewer than 1,000 students left out of 4.35 million. And the trustees in this room all looked around at each other and they said, wow, this idea of just going out and getting more of these students is obviously not a sustainable model for the future. And so what is? So as you think about those trends, you're probably thinking, wow, maybe I should get out of this business. I actually think that there is a strong future for institutions if they kind of rethink what they're doing and rethink their model. And I came across this quote from A.G. Lafley, who's the CEO of Procter & Gamble, who's a graduate, by the way, of a liberal arts college himself. And he talked about whether businesses are inherently in the commodity business or inherently in the innovation business. And my feeling is that increasingly more and more colleges have been and are in the commodity business today. And that in order to survive, in order to be a middleman that survives between the content producers, meaning the faculty, and the content consumers, being the students, they really have to get in the innovation business. And many of them need to segment their markets more. They need to look at beyond the 18-year-olds, of whom there are fewer and fewer these days. And they have to kind of rethink their models and rethink who they're serving and how they're serving. And for the most part, this hasn't happened in higher education. Even despite all the pressures on higher education over the last 4 or 5 years, we still haven't seen a lot of the innovations that should be happening today in American higher education. And, it's not that colleges are not innovative places. All the campuses that I visited over the last couple of years, I found a lot of innovations, but they tend to be in one department, in one school, on some corner of campus. There's a couple of professors doing very interesting things, but it's never at the academic core. And this really interested me, and I would always ask, well, why is that? Why are you doing this really cool experiment in your business school, but why are you not extending that beyond? Or why is this one department doing this really cool experiment, and why is it not at the academic core? And I kept hearing this thing. Everybody kept saying, well, we don't really want to be that different from our competitors, right? We don't want to look that different from the schools that we are competing with today, and we definitely do not want to be different than those schools that we want to be, that list of aspirational schools. This is a quote that Doug Toma, who is a late education researcher at the University of Georgia, came up with, where prestige is to higher education, what profit is to corporations. And it really drives, I think, a lot of decision-making in higher education, this prestige race, which really fueled this lost decade of last decade, where schools just spent more and more money on amenities and other things and went far into debt to do it, and didn't really kind of position their business for where higher education is going in the next 10 years. So I said earlier, I do not agree with Clay Christensen and others that the residential experience, that residential colleges are just going to close up shop in the next 5 or 10 years. And it's partly because, as I was researching the book, and I talked to whether it was employers, whether it was faculty members, whether it was trustees, I asked them, I said, tell me a little bit about your own undergraduate experience. And they would, their eyes would light up. And they would talk about one or two experiences that they just felt needed to happen in a residential community, needed to happen that couldn't easily be replicated online. And so as I started to hear that, the question I kept asking was, okay, so what one experience did you have that you don't think can be replicated online, that's really important, and that continues to happen on a residential campus? Now, some of the answers I can't tell you in public, so you can imagine some of the experiences that they had in college that they thought, well, if we went all online, that will never happen. But they kept talking about things that I think are critically important. I put them into four buckets, and to be honest with you, they're not rocket science. We can all figure this out. The first thing was faculty as mentors. So many of them talked about a faculty member that truly made a difference in their life, especially their first year. And what's ironic about this is that as colleges have been trying to position themselves over the course of the last couple of years by cutting costs, they've been cutting that precise thing. They've been cutting especially full-time faculty in order to save money, and those adjunct faculty members, nothing against adjunct faculty members since I am one now, but is that they just can't spend as much time with students as full-time faculty can, and they don't develop those longer-term relationships that full-time faculty can. And in fact, those 400,000 students that didn't complete, many of them that I met over the last couple of years, the first question I asked them, I said, did you get to know a faculty member in your first year? And most of them didn't. Most of them really didn't get to develop any type of relationship with a faculty in their first year. So it's faculty as mentors. Undergraduate research. Most employers didn't put it this way, but they talked about the benefits of what I think students get out of doing undergraduate research. That is, working in groups, working collaboratively, not knowing the answer to a problem before you start working on it, kind of failing fast and figuring out the solution. And every institution talks about how great they're doing in terms of undergraduate research. But the institutions I was most impressed with, and the ones that I featured in the book on this subject, were those that bake it into their DNA from day one. In other words, I don't think undergraduate research should be just a capstone experience, something that only seniors get, but something that should be baked into the experience from day one, and where it's a connective experience between the freshman, the sophomore, the junior, and the senior year. The third piece is the cross-cultural experience. And so many people think of this as study abroad. And the fact of the matter is even though we've been talking about study abroad and the world is flat for a decade plus now, fewer than 10% of American students study abroad. It's really about the cross-cultural experience of the stew of an American college campus, where students get together who come from different backgrounds, who have different perspectives, and are forced to live and learn in one environment. And part of the problem that I see online, part of the thing that I fear online, is that we tend to go to groups that we like, that agree with us. And on a campus, especially if it's done well, you're kind of forced to be with others that are quite different than you. And then finally, one of the things I heard over and over again was this idea of we need students who are creative, who can take risks, and who have learned how to fail. And in a residential campus, especially one that's done right, can do that and can do that well. I think this is going to be really hard for most institutions to bake all of this into their strategy in the future. As I said, I don't think you're going to see massive amounts of failures of institutions in the next couple of years, but some are going to struggle to do it on their own, are going to struggle to maintain their operations on their own. And I've been thinking about how institutions can rethink themselves for the future. And I think one thing that the MOOC platforms have taught us, whether it's the Coursera's of the world or the edX's of the world, is the deep academic cooperation that we see. So, for example, I've been flying a lot lately, and many of you who fly know all the airlines have formed these very deep alliances where you can make one reservation, fly on many airlines, all on one ticket. We have a lot of collaboration in higher education, but it tends to happen in the back office. It tends to happen, maybe we share some research, maybe we share some courses, but we don't really have the deep academic collaboration that, to be honest with you, might have to happen among some institutions in the future. So where students could have admission to one institution, go to many colleges over the course of that 4 years, or have many educational components, whether virtually or face-to-face, and then come out with one transcript and one portfolio at the end of the day. And in some ways, I think this is the only way that some institutions are going to be able to survive. And in some cases, some brands, I think, will be much stronger as a group like this, as an alliance, than they will be as any individual institution. Where I think this could be most helpful is really the transition points between high school and college and the workforce. Because this is where we're losing a lot of students. And at the same time, where a lot of outside organizations, Venture for AmeriCorps and Teach for America have been around for a long time, but we're starting to see a lot more outsiders try to fill in these gaps. So Venture for America, which places recent college graduates in startup companies very much after the Teach for America model. There's this new startup in New York, which is also now moving to D.C., called Institute, which is bringing back the idea of the apprenticeship and then building a curriculum around it. But in both of these cases, they're filling these gaps between college, when we used to think of it as just a 4-year experience that started after high school and was that thing that you did before you ventured into a career. And as we know from the work that I was citing earlier, the period of our 20s now is much more of an exploration period. And thinking of college within that box of just 4 years, I think, is a mistake. And many of these entities now are trying to fill in those gaps. Unfortunately, I don't think it's enough of the institutions themselves in terms of trying to prove their value doing it. And I think that they could, and that would be one way that the institution could remain that middleman that I was talking about earlier. Because I think it's a way that these institutions can prove their value. This is an interesting question that's been asked it's been asked many times in surveys over the last couple of months, and over the last couple of years, I should say. And they asked, it was Pew, Gallup, and a couple of other survey companies have asked this question about rating colleges for the job that they're doing, for the value that they're providing for the money spent. So not asking about college costs, but asking about value. And what's interesting about this is they asked parents this question, they asked college presidents this question, and they asked faculty this question. And so those who rated it good or excellent at the top in terms of value, 40% of the public. So only 40% of the public thinks the value they're getting in return for their money spent is very good. Presidents, everything's great. 76% of presidents think what they're doing is of very high value. So a couple of months ago, the Chronicle did this survey of 1,200 faculty, and I was thinking, well, the faculty might be closer to the presidents. They ended up lower than the public. 31%. Now, it's obviously only one survey, but 31% of the faculty thought that colleges were providing value for the money spent. To me, the next 10 years in higher education will be about proving value. It's not that the public doesn't think higher education is valuable, because if you look at any survey, more than 90% of them want their kids to go to college. But what increasingly they're doing is they're asking many more questions about the value of a specific degree from a specific college. And the averages, I think, these averages we used to throw out, you make X number more dollars over the course of your lifetime with a bachelor's degree, are no longer good enough. And parents want to know, is this a good investment for this $50,000 I'm giving to this one particular institution? And if colleges and universities don't figure out how to measure their value and communicate it themselves, others are going to do it for them. I was out at LinkedIn a couple of months ago and was visiting with the folks doing their university pages, which many of you might be familiar with. But now they have this massive amounts of data on their users, where they went to school, what jobs they hold, the skills they have. The amount of tracking now that they can do throughout a person's career is incredible, and they're only going to do more and more of it, especially now that they've lowered the age to 14. So they can start tracking students from the time they were in middle school and figure out the different career paths that they took. And so, again, if you don't do it, outsiders, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's the Obama administration, or others, are going to start proving the value for you. So let me end on talking about how those traditional colleges and universities, those campuses in the middle, can compete in the future. What role, in my opinion, do they have? And then I'll open it up for questions. First is building deep alliances, very much like the airlines have. Certifying experiences. We know that a bachelor's degree is more than just a random collection of 120 credits. And somebody at the end of the day will if students are going to end up swirling around a lot more, at the end of the day, somebody, some institution, or some group will have to certify those experiences, and I think colleges, traditional colleges, are well prepared to do that. Redesigning those transition points between high school and college and the workforce, proving value, and visualizing the learning experiences. A lot of what Jim was talking about in his talk this morning, where students are able to exhibit for employers and for others what they have done in the classroom. And so when I give this talk, somebody inevitably says, oh, well, the decline of higher education was predicted many times before. And in fact, it was. When I was doing research for the book, I found articles from almost every decade in the Chronicle where someone predicted thousands of colleges would go out of business. And you know what? We have more colleges and universities now than we've ever had in our history before. But the fact of the matter is that about 10 years ago, I was sitting at very similar conferences to this, and somebody would be talking about the future of journalism. And they would say many of the same things. They would say, well, journalism is changing. People will want to read newspapers on their on devices someday. They didn't say iPads, obviously, but on devices. And everybody would shake their heads and said it would never happen. Well, the fact of the matter is today, half as many reporters are employed in journalism than there were 10 years ago. So there was this massive shift over the last 10 years, and not only in journalism, but in publishing, in music, you name almost any other any industry. And so I don't think we can just say because this didn't happen in the past, it won't happen in the future. And in some ways, when all those reporters disappeared, I don't think most people cared. In fact, if you were on a town council or you were a politician or everybody else, you were kind of glad that we had fewer reporters, right? You didn't have anybody to bother you. But I think the stakes are really so much higher for this industry, mainly because of my kids and everybody else's kids who will be coming through this system in the next 20 years. It's my feeling that the industry is in trouble, but not the enterprise. The enterprise is, in fact, really strong, and it's what gives me so much hope for the future. And what I think we really just need to do is figure out how to put this industry on a sustainable path for the future. And so with that, I'm going to end, and I have a few minutes for questions, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just take a couple of quick questions, and I have to turn the mic over, or I'd like to turn the mic over to allow our sponsor for lunch to address the group here for a few minutes. But I think there's a question asked right here.
Yes. Hi, I'm Chris De La Rocas from Boston University. I'd like to thank you for a thought-inspiring talk. With respect to your recommendations for what colleges should do, I agree with a lot of them. But then I start to think, the same things could also be done by all the different entities that are now competing for the various aspects of the college bundle. Where do you think that colleges have a comparative advantage that they should capitalize on?
So the question is, where do colleges have the competitive advantage? So right now, I think part of it is in the signaling. So I think that employers, maybe not in the tech industry, but in almost every other industry, really trust the college degree more than they trust any alternative credentialing. So I think right now, and I don't think this is a hold you have forever, especially if you can't prove the learning that is behind those credentials. I mean, I think everybody saw the story this week where the average age at Harvard, or the average grade at Harvard now is an A-. We know that the average grade across all American higher education is the A. It's the most common one, given out 43% of the time. So I think that it's really that signaling piece that you still have a competitive advantage over everybody else, because it's the most trusted. It's still the most trusted thing when it comes to employers. That is the college degree given out by a traditional accredited institution. So I think that's probably the one big competitive advantage that you hold over others. Yes.
We've got two more, so one here or there, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for giving the lecture.
Sorry. Thank you.
Hi. So I thought it was really interesting when you talked about the things that people thought were best about their residential experience, like connecting with faculty mentors and doing research. To what extent do you think this can be replicated online in a virtual environment? Thank you.
Hard to know. It's a good question. So the question is replicating kind of the mentor relationship. You're doing much more research on this than I am, but I mean, I think part of the problem is scale. The strongest mentor relationships happen at smaller scale right now, right? So many of the work that George Q and others have done at Indiana University about high impact practices show that freshmen, for example, who get to know faculty members in their first semester or their first year are less likely or more likely to be retained and less likely to drop out. If you look at engagement surveys, those mentor relationships tend to be strongest at smaller colleges and universities, mainly because those have full-time faculty. They have smaller classes. It's much easier to get to know faculty members. So the question I have online is, it's not that I don't think they can't be replicated. I think they can. The question is, how do you do it at scale? How can you replicate at scale? And I think if you can solve that, I think that's a huge advantage over these large universities now that I think are having trouble making those connections. Oh, sorry.
Hi. It's not so much a question as a comment, or actually a thank you for including the point about these transition periods between high school and college. One of the things that I've been most alarmed about in the last couple of years, looking at research on education and learning, is the great divide between the K-12 world and the higher ed world. And I think that until we bridge that and figure out ways to make that transition more possible and smoother for more students, we're going to find, no matter how we innovate higher education, we have to have kids prepared to deal with that, whatever it's going to look like. And they can't succeed there in any form if they aren't ready to take advantage of those.
Well, and I think part of the problem is we see it as a transition. And I think that we need to blend that experience more. We know that, for example, the senior year of high school in many places is kind of a waste. And so I think, and we know at the other end that, again, these students are struggling to launch after college graduation. So we have to stop thinking that this is just something that you do. You graduate from high school, 3 months later you go to college, you graduate from college, then you go into the workforce. I think we need to see this much more as a continuum, because students are seeing it much more as a continuum because of delayed adolescence and because they see their lives extending much further than their parents' lives or their grandparents' lives.
All right, well, thanks very much, Jeff, for a great talk and a great way to get things stirring on what is the role that we can see MOOCs playing in the broader education sector. So thank you.
Thank you.
And on behalf of
Okay, thank you.